Okay, book 1 then has got 16 chapters. Book 2 will also have 16 chapters, and book 2 will come out next summer, so this time next year. And we are working on it and writing it, and we'll be trialing it through this year. For those of you in the US, book 1 should quite comfortably cover NLE 1, and book 2 should cover National Latin Exam 2 plus a bit more. For those of us in the UK, books 1 and 2 should cover the language content for GCSE, with the OCR examination material towards the, or the stuff that's only OCR, I should say, towards the end of book 2. And then, as we've said before, if this all goes okay, then we'll look at book 3. And if people say, please stop, then we will stop at the end of book 2. Right. Each chapter has 16 pages and 10 of them are language. So it's around about 2/3 of the content is language material. Although we're going to focus today on teaching language, I just want to remind everybody it's a character-based course. And so one of the best things we can do in our preparation is get to know these characters well. And I know to start with, probably the first year you go through, you won't really know the characters too well. As you teach it for the second, third year, they'll very quickly, I think, start to become friends, and you'll start to bring out things that you hadn't really noticed before, and so on. So you do try to get to know them a little bit. Okay, let's focus then on language for the rest of the session. And I thought we'd start by looking at the linguistic map. That's the order in which language points are introduced. And this is the language map for the first book. And I know we've looked at it a little bit in earlier sessions, but we've got a bit more time today to go into a bit more detail. And first of all, stepping back a little bit, the first book really overall does all the cases except the locative. We're not really planning to have a language note on the locative. So it does all the cases: nominative and accusative, genitive, dative, ablative. And for those of us in the UK, it might be worth realizing that in the US, cases are actually ordered slightly differently, and vice versa. So let's have a look at how those cases come in. So we start, whoops, let's go back, sorry. Started in chapter 2, looking at the nominative and accusative. Now, why is that? Well, really, that's because this is primarily a reading course, although you can teach it, feel free to teach it in whatever way you like, but it's primarily within the content of the textbook, at least, reading material. And if you want to get interesting sentences to put into a story, you need nominative and accusative for people to start being able to do things. And it's that really, that is the prime driver of the order in which things happen. So I think we had a question one of the previous sessions, well, why don't we do the genitive earlier? And you can see the genitive is here in chapter 11. Well, we did think, actually, we did plan at one point to have it come in chapter 9. But actually in the writing of the material, the dative case was more useful than the genitive. It was more useful to be able to have somebody giving something to somebody or doing something for somebody than it was to say who something belonged to. And there were other ways of getting around that. So the exact order in which things happen is really driven by the usefulness of that particular part of language. When we introduce nominative and accusative, we do that across the first three declensions. Let me just show you. So it's very light touch in the textbook. So this is when we explicitly bring in nominative and accusative. And you can see there we've got contrasting uses of the cases in those first three sentences. And there's a fair bit going on there from a student's point of view. The whole idea of case to almost all students will be completely new. So we're introducing the concept of case, and we're introducing the idea of the nominative and the accusative. And we might, in a class, I would probably use the term subject and object, but we tend not to do that in the textbook because we don't want to introduce additional terminology. So there we are, very light touch introducing nominative and accusative. The next language point almost has to be declension, because the students are going to see words that have an A here have am, and words that have us have and there's a whole lot of others that don't end in A or us that have M. So you're almost forced at that point to have a note on declensions. And so there it is, and it's very straightforward, and all we're really trying to do is say, look guys, there's a load of words that end in A. In the accusative, they end am. And similarly for the others. The sort of the very light touch of way of doing that, as I do with some of the students in my class, is to say, look guys, if the word ends in M, it's not doing anything. And now that will work, for the short term. It won't work long term, but it will work for a little while. We wondered about gender, and we did a lot of, I don't know whether the right word is research. We asked a lot of teachers how they felt about bringing in gender at this point. There's a school of thought to say you never need to teach gender in Latin if you're reading, because you very rarely need to know the gender of a noun to work out what's going on. Well, that's sort of maybe an extreme side of things. Our feeling in the end was we would put a light touch note in on gender, because most teachers want to cover gender at some point, and we might as well pop it in at this point, because we're doing first declension. They're pretty much going to be feminine, aren't they? Second declension are pretty much masculine, and the rest, the third declension, can be whatever you like. So we have followed up with a note on gender, but again, it's very light touch. Really, you could say that it's actually just point 1 and point 5 are the bits that you want the students to focus on. But it's probably no bad thing that we tell them about how things tend to map out for the first and second declensions. And we do look ahead to the neuter in there as well, just literally letting them know that it exists. And then here telling them, when you look up a word in the back of the book, that's what those abbreviations are going to mean. So super light touch. Let's go back to that map. We, by chapter 5, have covered all the persons of the verb and the infinitive. So that was purposefully trying to see really, as you can see there, chapter 6 is the end of the main Rome section. We wanted to think by the time we've done that main Rome section, they've done all the persons of the verb. And because we've been using prepositions with the ablative, we thought we might as well pick up on that as well. Chapter 5 is a fairly light touch chapter, really. Possum, isn't really a big deal, given that they've already seen some, and Nolo and Wallow, for those of us following a reading approach, they still have the appropriate sort of personal endings. As we move into the Britain section, what we're really starting to do then is play around with tenses. So we look at the imperfect and the perfect, start to bring in adjectives, and that's where we pick up the other two main tenses. If you look here at what's going on in chapter 10, 11, and 13, chapter 10, adjectives describe nouns. Then we have genitives, which also tell us something, modify the noun. And then in chapter 13, we have relative clauses, which also tell us something about the noun. So that's a part of the course where, as we are introducing an adjective, and then a genitive, and then a relative clause. It's allowing us to expand the sentence length and expand the complexity, and allowing us to make the stories more interesting, because we can do a little bit more with these nouns. By the end of the first book, we've picked up most of the tenses. We haven't done the pluperfect. We'll do that in 17, but we haven't done the pluperfect, and we haven't done the rest of the future. We'll do that in 18. Okay, and the future perfect will come along later on as well. And as I think I've said before, might find that putting the indirect statement in there is sort of a bit surprising, but it's trying to do it in a way which is fairly easy, the easiest version of it, and allowing the students to get used to that before we play around with it a bit more later on. Okay, we've had a look at those. Let's go on to the language plan for the second book. Now, we're writing the second book at the moment, and we will be trialing it this year. And just as the book 1 language map didn't end as it began, I would imagine that this one won't end up looking like this either, but it will look fairly similar. So chapters 17 to 19, we start book 2 in Pompeii, and we thought, you know, often when you come to your second book, it's like a second album, isn't it, of a band. It can be a sort of, you know, things can go a bit wrong. So we thought, actually, let's go to Pompeii, where there's a lot of great stuff going on, and we can start second book with, you know, great times. So that is where we're finishing up the active indicative there. Then in the North Africa section, 20 to 22, you see we start to bring in the passive, and imperfect and present passive to start with. The things that have got a yellow background to them are the key elements of that particular chapter. Okay, and things in green are verb or verby, things in blue are nouns, and stuff in orange is more syntax. So you can see that book 2, as always, really as things get more complicated, tends to be heavier focus on what's going on, different approaches to verbs, because we pretty much cover the bases on the nouns. You can see here in 24, we're bringing the 4th and 5th declension. Whether they'll end up as 2 separate language notes or not, we'll have to see how we go with that. So North Africa section, bringing in the passive. Then we go into the subjunctive here, right through really until 28. So now if you're a UK school doing EduCass, then all your assessment boxes for language are ticked by chapter 28. Okay, so you don't have to go further than that. And again, if you're UK, we've put brackets around the things which are OCR only. So we've tried to keep most of the OCR only material towards the end of book 2, so that those of you who are on a tight time schedule, you know, you're not teaching more stuff than you have to. Some of it we've put in earlier on, sorry, let's go back. So for example, the pluperfect passive indicative, pluperfect passive, well, it seemed a bit weird to have the perfect passive here. So we do the PPP, and then out of the perfect passive participle, we can then move into the perfect passive just by adding on, you know, some SS. And it seemed a bit strange to not actually at that same point show the students the pluperfect passive, even if some of us, you know, aren't going to need to assess the students on it. For those of us in the US, Canada, and elsewhere using NLE, I think, you know, this is some of this towards the end is really getting into NLE 3 territory, isn't it, really? So you should cover off your NLE 2 boxes fairly swiftly there. And just to say, down the right hand side, maybe hidden by our little thumbnails, extra material that we thought we'd put online. So things that perhaps not everybody wants to do with all the students, but some teachers might want to do with everybody, or some teachers might want to do with some students. So those would be additional online language notes and materials there. Okay, so that's the map overall. We can come back to sort of questions on it, I guess, later on, but let's before we go any further, um, let's just sort of go back here. People often say, well, why didn't you do this earlier or that late? Well, just if you just look at the way all of this is organized, of course, anything can go earlier. But if you put anything earlier, then everything else goes later. So, I often say to people, we can't teach all of Latin grammar in one lesson. So you've got to work out what the bits are and put them in some sort of order. And that's why, we teach 1, 2, 3, 4, 5-year Latin courses, isn't it? You don't do it on day one. You've got to spread it out. So for sure, you can always make good arguments for moving something around, bringing something further forward, pushing it back. I think we've got to be a little bit cautious about putting the teaching language elements in the way they are stored in a primer or a grammar book, and so on. So, you could argue, well, why don't we do the nominative and the genitive right together at the beginning, because that's handy for, for the dictionary and the vocab list and so on. But it would lead to some pretty bizarre storylines, I think. And so the reality is, you have to, if you want to make it fluid in terms of reading, you have to actually say you can't map to those things that we put in vocab lists, even though we've tried to do that as well as we can here. If you think in terms of verbs, we've got the first person in chapter 1, the infinitive in chapter 5, and the perfect first person, the perfect in chapter 7. So by chapter 7, that stuff is there. Okay, let's have a quick look at teaching a chapter. The first thing I will say, please, when you come to teach a chapter, is do look at the teacher's guides, the teaching notes. There is a load of material there. If you've got a web subscription, they're all in the teacher's area of the relevant section of the online version of the book. If you haven't got a subscription to the website and you really want these teachers' notes, we will happily find a way of getting them to you. Okay, so please do use them. There's a huge amount of material there, and I find myself, when I'm going back to a story, thinking, what would I do with this? Looking back at these notes myself. So do use those. Okay, let's look. I thought we'd look at sort of two ends of the spectrum, chapter 1 and chapter 14, when we look at what we might do with a chapter. The first thing is that these chapters don't exist out of context. And if here we are in the Subura, what you might want to do actually is go back a bit in the course and look at the map of Rome and start by thinking, where is all of this happening? And you might want to go back a bit further than that and think, well, actually, where is Rome? So it's that whole thing, isn't it, of putting ourselves in the shoes of the students and thinking, actually, where are they coming from? So we might actually start chapter 1 by giving the students some wider context to what is going on. And there's all sorts you could do with a map like that. I'm sure many of us love looking at maps and seeing what we can see and asking questions. And sorry that some of these are, I should say, are screenshots of our print version of the book that we send to the printers, so it might look a bit sort of weird, but you can look at that and how is space used and so on, and all sorts of things you can do, and what might that river be, and all loads of things going on there. And then you can sort of settle on finding out where the Subura is, and then you can go back to this. The other thing you might want to do if you're new to the course is just sort of flick through and see what are the language notes for a particular chapter. So just have a quick look. Okay, this is chapter 1. There's a language note, who's doing what, and I can see this is OST, and then sum est. Okay, so that's going to happen. And also there's going to be a note here about reading Latin, and this note says, let's try to read Latin where we can from left to right. So those are the two language notes for the chapter, and therefore that's what the chapter's going to be focusing on. One tip I would always say if you're new to using a reading course is you want to take the heat off the language note as much as you can. And what I mean by that is when you arrive at the language note in the book, if the students have already got a fairly good handle on what's going on in that language note, they're going to be much happier. They're going to arrive at that language note and say, oh yeah, well, I pretty much know all of this. This is great. I'm the best student of Latin in the world. So you're going to make them feel really positive. If they arrive at a language note and the whole thing is new, it's going to be a bit of a bump for them. So try in the planning to ensure that before they get to language note, they've at least covered some of the ground. Okay, so let's look. Chapter 1, here we are. It's Sabina in the Subura. And let's have a look here. Again, you could use the teacher's notes for this, but one of the things I think that is really, really important is try to get our questions sort of spot on for the students. And I would really want my students to be arriving at the point where they're going to be able to translate ego sum Sabina as I am Sabina. It's not actually as easy as it might sound, because of course, if we ask questions like, who is this person? They're going to say, she's Sabina or just Sabina. So we've got to put in their questions like, well, she's introducing herself. If she's introducing herself, what might she be saying? So things like that that will elicit the outcome of I am Sabina. So one tip I would always give is try to think what exact question is going to lead the students to give the answer that you want them to give. If you say something like, what was she saying? They might say that she was Sabina. So you want to say things like, she's speaking here. What words is she using to introduce herself? And then ego in Subura habito. So what might she be saying about where she lives? So think really carefully about the questions that you're going to ask to help the students get the right meaning out of the Latin. Here in number 3, hora prima est, really interesting. There's so much going on there. First of all, again, use the image to help you. Can you see Hannah spent ages, first of all, we had to get the angle right, and it's got to look like it's sunrise rather than sunset and all of that sort of stuff. So use that image to say, okay, well, look over the horizon. You could ask a question like, does it look like, is it nighttime or is it the start of the day? You could give a really easy question like that. So they've only got a choice of 2 and they're bound to go for start of the day. You could say, well, does it look like it's sunrise or later on? You could just say, okay, have a look at that picture, have a look at the sky, and then let's look at the Latin, hora prima est. Okay, can we guess what hora might mean if it's referring to something to do with a time? And then which hour is it? And they'll probably get that without too much trouble. It's the first hour. Now then, immediately this is really interesting, because of course for the Romans, the first hour was the first hour of daylight. So if we were to say, okay, it's the first, we might leave it at it's the first hour, but it's better to, I think, to work out with the students, what does that mean? We might ask them, what do we think that means? It's the first hour. They might say 1 o'clock. Well, then we can look at the picture again. Okay, let's look at that picture. Does it look like 1 o'clock, or is it earlier in the day? What do the Romans mean by the first hour? And of course, for them, it meant the first hour of daylight. So there's a lot going on there to unpack. And one of the things this chapter does, if I just flick through a little bit, you can see here in the second story, hora octava est. It's the 8th hour. And then if I flick through again, sorry, I've missed it here. Later on, it's nox. So we're very gently, sorry to flip really quickly, but very gently giving them a sense of a Roman day. The main language point, as I said earlier on, is going to be OST for are you, he, she, or it. And you might need to sort of drag your little thumbnails out of the way for this. I'm going to look at the right-hand side of this page. It's not chance that in number 8, Faustus asks his sister, tu dormis? because that allows us to have her say ego non dormio. So that's on purpose trying to show two different versions of the same verb. Similarly, if we come over here, in number 10, tu laboras, ego laboro. You know, and that goes back to image number 8 here, pater in insula laborat. So we are purposefully playing around with different forms of the same verb, so that in the class, once you've read it through, I wouldn't do this on first reading, but once you've read it through that first time, you might say, okay, let's go back now. What did tu dormis mean? And you might pop that up on a screen, on the board, you know, however we're displaying things. And then I might put next to it, are you sleeping? And then what did ego dormio, ego non dormio mean? I'm not sleeping. And I might do something similar with laboro and laboras and laborat. And similarly, we've got here in number 16, tu legis, then 17, ego non lego, and in 20, she's again saying, actually, I am reading, and then they catch her, Sabina legit. So we've got those various versions of the same verb. And again, that allows us then to, once we've read it, to consolidate, come back, put that up on the board or the projector and say, okay, let's have a look at these. I do this, you do that, he or she does this other thing. We are purposefully here using ego and tu a lot, like all the time at the minute, so that they can't go wrong. And one of the sort of main things I would say when you're introducing a language point is that is the time I'm an incredibly lazy person. So I would often try and do as little as possible. But even I would say when I'm introducing a new language point, it's complete focus. Everything has got to be just right. Because if they learn it and understand it correctly first time round, they're going to be fine most of the time. But it's like, you know, sometimes you go to somebody's house and you can't remember the way, and you go the wrong way to start with. And then the next time you go, you're never quite certain which way it is. If you make the pathway wrong at the outset, it's really hard to get it right later on. So in these introductory sections where we're starting with a new language point, that is the time to be super cautious and conscious of exactly everything that we're doing. Okay, so that's that first story, trying to show the students various ways of saying the same thing, well, you know, different persons of the same verb, and giving us as teachers opportunities to do that. And as I said, once I'd read the story first time, I'd then go back and look at those forms so that then when I get to the language note about it, it's not new. You know, they think, yeah, actually, I'm okay with that. Similarly with sumes est. We haven't really got the time right now to go into it, but if you look back carefully at that story, you see that we've taken a bit of care also with something like est to give different versions where it can mean is, it is, or there is. Okay. Okay, let's just sort of quickly flick through the chapter. This story, this chapter's got 3 stories then. We've got that original story with Sabina, then we've got Lucilius here, and then we've got the story Knox there. Okay, now for those of you new to a reading course, don't think, let me just flip back a bit, don't feel that if all the students haven't completely got what's in the language note at that point, then you know there's never an opportunity. The whole point of these courses is to keep doing this stuff again and again and again. So great, if as many students as possible get it straight away, perfect, but there's going to be lots of I and you and he, she, it in the rest of these stories. And again, in the teacher's notes, we've got examples, ideas of where you can make the stories longer and ideas for some text with some of these initial stories that you can put in to get more forms of I and you in there. Because if you look at this one, there actually isn't. We couldn't get into this version any form of I in there. So in the teacher's notes, you'll see there is more there. Okay, so that's looking at it sort of in its context. This is now seeing that first story with the language pulled out. So you can just see here, tu dormis, ego non dormio, laborat, tu laboras, ego laboro, and here again, and in blue, we've got Lego being worked. And so hopefully you can see how that is designed to sort of show the new language point. And that's the same every single topic that's introduced. Okay, if you want to do more, because some people will want to do conjugations, we don't put that in the book, because if we put it in the book, teachers feel they have to teach it to everybody, and we didn't want to send out that signal. So some people want to do it, some don't. So you'll find online in the teachers area then additional resources, again, for those maybe just 1 or 2 students who are always asking more questions and are really looking carefully at the language, then they can go into the conjugations there if they want to, and a little practice exercise on it. Let's have a look at 14. 14, other end of the spectrum then, but really exactly the same principle. Chapter 14, again, if we were to flick through it, we'd see it's got the future tense coming up with wakabo there and ero, and it's got comparison coming up. Okay, so those are the 2 things we want to be alive to. Obviously, it's also going to be thinking, well, what happened in 13? There were relative clauses, and what happened in 12 with the vocative and imperatives, and what happened in 11. So every additional chapter has got 1 more ball to juggle. So when the stories are being written for each successive chapter, we've got more and more things that we need to get an example of this in. And obviously, you can't get an example of everything in every story, but that's something that one has in mind. So with that in mind, future and comparison, let's just have a little flick through chapter 14 to get the overall picture. It's set in southern Gaul, in Arles, and we're looking at mosaic making. So this is the chapter as a whole, just so you can see how the sort of, the stories and the sieve interleave. So just go back a bit. We've got a story, then we've got some sieve, then we've got a story, then we've got a language point, then we've got a picture story, then we've got some language practice, then we've got some sieve again, and then we've got an item on history. So that's the sort of all of them, I think, all the chapters are designed like that. Oh yeah, let me just go back now then, sorry again to flick. We're introducing the future, and it really starts happening here in speech bubble number 6 on that first page. And you can see down here, we've glossed, bottom left, we've glossed Harry as yesterday and Kras as tomorrow. And then if you look in speech bubble 6, you'll see what's going on. We've got ita vero in foro diu laboravimus. So we've got that laboravimus there. Then notice we've got hodie ... laboramus, and then we've got class ... laborabimus. So again, that's not chance. We've purposely tried to construct the story in such a way that we can say, well, yesterday I did this thing, or we did this thing, today we are doing this thing, and tomorrow we will do this thing. Well, if you've got class at the start of your sentence, it's pretty hard to do anything other than translate the verb as future. And that's done on purpose. What does he say that they will or we will do tomorrow? Or where does he say that we'll be working tomorrow? We'll be working here. So that's purposely designed to make sure that the students are going to translate that one as future. And then you could, if you wanted to, you could stop at that point and say, okay, well, let's have a look. How is that formed? Or do you notice anything different between laboramus and laborabimus? And you could put the 2 next to each other and say, how has that changed? How's the meaning changed? Well, how do you think the form relates to the meaning? So you could do that straight away if you want to, but there are plenty more examples. So let's go flick through here. This is looking at that same bit of text, but without the pictures all around it. And you can see then it goes on, erit, erunt, erunt, and then hodie adiuo, cras adiuabo. Doce bis, cras doce bo, and I haven't highlighted it up here, but that's comparing with docere there. And you'll see very often when a new language point is being brought in, another item, as I said in this chapter, is comparison. So we've got litior here, but it's not standing on its own. There's very purposefully a litar here and a litissimus there. Okay, and similarly, when we're showing the students pulchrior, then it's based on pulchra here. So look out for that. With every language point, have a look to see, you know, for example, if we're introducing the dative singular, has this noun appeared in the nominative earlier in the sentence or a couple of lines? You'll find that very often it has. And again, look at the teacher's notes have lots of explanation of that. You know, very often we've gone through and said, okay, there are 9 examples of the dative singular, and here they are. This is them. They're on these lines, and then on these other lines are the same word in the nominative or the accusative. So that's showing you how things are going with the introduction of comparison there, but also we're interweaving in that again the future. And if you look down here, amo, amabo, amo again. So again, trying to compare the one with the other. And this is another story in that same chapter, manere autabire, and everything colored up in green is in the future. And the stuff in orange here, again, we're looking at lighter. We should have been a little bit more sort of exciting and try to get different adjectives in, but lighter, litior, litissima, and slightly more complex here because we're a little further into the chapter now, junior coming in there. Okay, so that's a sort of a little guide in which the way the language develops through a reading course. And really, again, the main point is to say, don't leave all the heavy lifting for the language note. Try to get at least some of the content or some of the concepts, I should say, across in the stories before you reach the language note, and then consolidate that afterwards. So by now, 14.3, they've had the language note on the future. So here, narragabis, they might correctly if I ask someone to have a go at that, they might say, okay, to Lusitania with young Alexandra, will you sail, Sabina? So will you sail to Lusitania with the young Alexander? So one of the students might get that right, and I said, fantastic, that's good. How do you know that narragabis is future and not present? Or if they're not comfortable with the terminology, how do you know it's you will sail rather than you are sailing or you were sailing? So that question, how do you know something, is really handy because it's going to force that student to say, because it's got BI, and everybody else in the classroom is going to hear that. So the student who might struggle with recognizing it as a future is going to hear from somebody else, that's how this person knew it. Okay, and you can do that again and again and again. You know, my students get sick of Griffiths asking always how we know stuff. Manebis, how do we know that that is, you know, you will remain or will you remain? Whoops. Okay. So with all of these things, that question, how do you know, or how did, you know, Mary know or Fred know? Okay. So a few tips then before we move on. When you're introducing a language point for the first time, that is the point to really do all your planning really carefully. What exact questions am I going to ask about this particular sentence or particular statement that is going to lead the student to say what I want them to say? So that use of leading questions that makes it pretty much impossible for somebody to get it wrong. Just at the start, I'm not saying, you know, always we ask questions which are super easy, but that structure, I think, is massively important. How do you know something? Again and again and again, at least to start with. This question about reading rather than terminology, and of course it depends what your style is. If you really, if you are going for writing Latin and so on, when you might want them to know the terminology really, really strongly, then you've got to build that in maybe a little sooner. But for those teachers working on reading, bear in mind that being able to understand what something says it isn't the same thing as knowing the terminology, and one doesn't sort of necessarily lead into the other. If you've got something like Faustus est in popina, they can say Faustus is in the bar. Great, they don't actually need to know that est is, or they don't need to be able to define that est is the third person singular of the, the active indicative of the irregular verb esse. They just know that est means is. And so with in popina as well, they don't necessarily need to say at that point that it's that popina is ablative or ablative singular of a first declension noun. So not to say that those things are wrong, but to think, well, if I ask the student what case is it, actually, is that going to help the student or not help? For some it will, some it won't. Some, many, all, that really is back to the sort of OST sort of idea for really for me, my bottom line would be all students should be able to see if there's an O on the end, I'm doing it. If there's an S on the end, you're doing it. T on the end, he, she, it's doing it. I might want a lot of them to be okay with the terms first person, second person, third person. I might want some of them to have an awareness of conjugations. So, maybe I might be doing the wrong thing, but I don't have a view when I'm teaching that all students have to come out knowing the same stuff. I'm thinking these guys over here, they are super hot. I'm going to try and push them on these things. I know that these guys are struggling a little bit. And so I'm going to say, the really bottom line is you need to know this shorthand way of getting through this something. We talked about mapping it out a little bit and not trying to do it all in one go. Whatever approach you use, whatever course, I know we're all individuals, aren't we? We might want to bring in things early and so on, do things later. Just bear in mind, if you do bring in something earlier, that means that lesson is doing that earlier thing and everything else gets shunted back. Pretty much whatever course you use, but certainly in Suburani, everything is going to get covered at some point. So, it's just a question of, are you comfortable with that order? And, unlike me here now sort of going on and on and on, the students really remember doing stuff rather than us telling them things. So the more they can be reading and going back and rereading or practicing something, the better. Okay, let's have a look briefly at the vocabulary that we've chosen for the course and how we've gone about that. So these are the two sort of main drivers again. The Dickinson list of the sort of top 1,000 most common verbs in Latin, words, I should say, in Latin literature. I think I may have mentioned in other sessions, it's not that there is one list. The most common words in literature depend on what literature you look at. So if you only look at Virgil, you're not going to get the same list of most common 1,000 verbs you would get if you only looked at Pliny, for example. So one's got to be a little bit cautious about that. And there are other lists are available as well, but really for most of them, the top 600 words are actually pretty similar, and it's only once you get out of the top 600 that things start becoming a little bit less there's less agreement, if you like. So I know that's a big driver for schools in the US. Schools in the UK obviously are concerned about what the exam board, the GCSE exam board, use. So we've taken that into account as well. So what we've done is group words. If they're in the top 500 Dickinson, we give it a sort of, it's in the one zone. Next, 500, so sort of 501 to 1000, it's given a 2. And if it's not in the top 1000, it gets a 3. And then for the UK, it gets a B if it's in both exam boards lists, E if it's in one but not the other, and N if it's not in either of them, which means that a word like puto, which is in the top 500 of Dickinson and both UK exam boards use it, is a B1 word, which for us is top priority. A word like arrepente, which isn't in the top 1000 and it doesn't come up in either exam board list, gets given an N3. So it means we might, not always, we're not going to never use the word, but we will more often than not want to use subito in that situation instead, because that's in the top 1000 and it's in both exam lists. And we track all of this vocabulary because we are the most boring people in the world, very, very carefully. So all words go into a sort of a data set, and you can see there then down the left-hand side, that's where every word is categorized. If the word is colored up under the head word red, that's just a warning, try to avoid using it. If it's green, that's a word we should be happy to use. For those of you in the UK, actually for everybody, you might see, well, we might come and have a look at that a bit later on, but let's have a look at these words here that highlighted yellow with the red. That's a thing for the UK, in that the exam board needs ago to also be learned as drive. So we are just tracking for ourselves. We've used the word as do or act, but we haven't yet used it as drive. Okay, so it's that sort of thing. The other thing you can see here is we track when it first gets used, which chapter, then we track the third time it's been used, and then we track when we've put it in a vocab for learning list, and then you can see our data on the exam boards and Dickinson and so on. And if we go on over here, so this is then where we've got the exact Dickinson number. And then here in these columns, the C stands for chapter. This is running total of the use of that word or its frequency, chapter by chapter by chapter, word by word by word. And then what we do is we apply some metrics to that, and then we can see we haven't used this word for 3 chapters. We ought to try and use it again. So that's one of the ways in which we try to make sure that the vocabulary, the core vocabulary, is used and is repeated frequently enough for the students. Yeah, I think we talked about that really, so let's move on. Some words, and this is really looking at the word Regina, some words are, they're on the UK exam list, or they're in the Dickinson sort of top 1000, but it's actually really hard to get them into stories. So a word like Regina, we sometimes say when Sabina's getting married, oh, Sabina, you look like you will be a queen. Yes, I will be a queen, to try to get the word used a bit. But also we will sometimes use the language exercises to get in some of that vocabulary that hasn't come up for a while in a story. So if sometimes those sentences seem a bit weird, that's because we're trying to resurrect some vocabulary that hasn't been used for a while. And I mean, on that point, and this is more of a UK issue, we had to make some fairly tough decisions about things that the UK exam boards don't do very well, because of really because of the Cambridge Latin course using something like villa to mean a house in a street, where villa doesn't mean a house in a street. So we've taken decisions like that. Villa is used for a country house, really. So we've taken decisions that we're actually not going to use villa in a house in a street context, on the whole, because we just think if we do that, it's just going to embed it further. So again, something like taberna, which I've spent 20-30 years thinking of meaning a shop or an inn. Actually, we've used taberna just for the shops, and we've used popina for the bar. And popina isn't a word that I knew for sure before any of this, but it's the more accurate word for a bar in that situation. So that's why we've done that sort of thing. We thought we ought to, this course sticks around for 20 years. We don't want it to be we don't want to be doing things that we shouldn't be doing. So we've done that. Occasionally makes a bit of a bump. The same sort of thing, just as in passing, the in a chariot racing track, the bit down the middle, I spent 30 years calling it a spina. Well, apparently it shouldn't actually, and everywhere you go, look, people use the term spina, except when you look at what academics are calling it, and I think they call it a Euripus. So we've gone for what it really should be called. So there'll be a few places like that where you think, this is a bit of a bump. But let me just show you as well some of the other ways we track words. So we can take an individual word and see exactly where it's come up so far in the course. And then, which chapters does it come up in? And then we can click on these various words on the top right, and that will show us exactly where it is in the story. And we're looking at making this available to teachers using the course as well, so that if you're, creating some materials, you want to say, well, when was this word last used, or have they seen this? Then that will be useful. Certainly, we find it extraordinarily useful for writing. Similarly, if you look bottom left, you can ignore ago as the head word there because I've put no for that. But if we want to find how many times have we used a noun in the dative singular, we can do that, and it will tell us every single instance of that particular form. So that allows us again to track, have we got enough examples of this thing at this point? And we could say, more precisely, well, what about third declension nouns in the singular? So okay, that then feeds into the vocab for learning, just to say then that I think 85% of the words here are in the Dickinson top 1000, and I think 65% are in the top 500, and those that aren't are high value words. I think, as I said before, actually something like ankilla, for example, doesn't make it to the top Dickinson 1000, but we felt it's an important word to have in. UK uses it for assessment, and so in it goes. So those are all words that are in the UK exams, and as I say, about 85% in the top 1000. We've put them all together at the back of the book, partly for photocopying. So, you can bung the book on the photocopier and, do A3. You've got one double-sided sheet of A3, I suppose, is all the vocab. If you want the students to learn previous chapters, it's easier. And also from our point of view, it just saves a bit of space. In terms of which sort of bits get brought in as you go through, what parts of what nouns and verbs. If you look back here in chapter 1, we're just giving the head word. Chapter 2, because we've brought in the accusative, we start to give the accusative forms together with genders, and that is handy primarily for third declension nouns. Then in chapter 5 we start to bring in infinitives, and in chapter 7 we're giving the first 3 persons. We haven't done it yet, but I'm fairly certain we could pop that up online if people want, all, or you want the sort of nominative and genitive and gender and all the principal parts from chapter 1. I'm sure we could do that. So that's how that goes. Sometimes a word like insula comes up twice in those lists because we use it with Faustus, who looks after a block of flats or a tenement building. And so there he is. This is him in picture 4 in chapter 7. We've had this word millions and millions of times, meaning flats. And then in the same story in number 9, because we want to get the students now to think of it as also meaning an island. Well, a lot of students might say, well, is Britannia is it a floating block of flats? Well, probably not. It's his question is actually, is it a floating island? And the Romans did think that some islands floated. So we've purposefully juxtaposed those fairly closely together, so it's in the same story. When we first introduce that different version or different meaning of that word, in a way which hopefully will mean it's pretty clearly in the student's minds. I once had a student in an assessment write that Julia swam back from a block of flats that she'd been exiled to. So it is surprising, isn't it, sometimes what they don't remember. But okay, so just to sum that up, in those vocabularies, gender comes in two, along with the accusative. Infinitive, 5. Well, you can see there where those various bits come in. Okay, very quickly, how are we doing for time? We might run over if that's okay. If you've got online access, then we've built in this sort of support for their vocabulary here. So on the right hand side, again, our faces might be over it, but we've got Laborat. If they click on that, it will tell them that it means works. It is works. You might see at the top here, neither of these pars or roots boxes are highlighted or checked. If they check it, then it will tell them at that point it's a verb third person. And if they go for roots as well, then it will give them derivations. We haven't done this yet, and I know we've got a load of things that we want to do, so I don't want to get some people's hopes up too much too soon, but we have a lot of plans to take the tech forward, and one of the things I want to do is give us as teachers control about whether the students can or can't do these things, because I know some of us don't want the students clicking on the words all the time, or maybe building in, you get a maximum of 10 clicks, or there's a bit of a delay or something like that. So please don't think that is happening now. It is not happening now, but it's on our sort of want to do list. Here's the same sort of thing happening in a in a normal story. Okay. In the teachers area online, there are quite a lot of additional support materials, and we will, again, just that will grow over time. So you can see there teaching notes, comprehension in different styles, derivations, and so on. Let's just have a little look through those. So we didn't put any of the comprehensions in the book because it just sucks up space. So loads of comprehensions. I think we've got one per chapter online. Now we have a colleague going and doing a second per chapter. So there will be, in time, there will be 2 comprehensions per chapter. And you get access to the answers as well. I should say there is another version of this comprehension which doesn't have the little dotted line. So if you just want to photocopy it and as little paper as possible, or display it on the screen, then there's another version there. And then one of the team has put together derivations, particularly because colleagues in North America really keen on that. So derivations for each chapter, and a set of 10 Latin questions for those who like to have questions in Latin. So they're there. The right hand side is not, this isn't very clear, is it? The right hand side is not the answers. The answers are currently in production. But just to show that on the right hand side, another thing you get online is occasionally additional evidence on the cultural topic, which may well have bits of language in there that you want to use. Hannah has created versions of all the picture stories that don't have the Latin text in them, because a teacher said, oh, could we do that? And so, yeah, I think Hannah just very rapidly went through that. They're in color and they're also in black and white. So again, if you want to give the students a sheet like that, and they can pop their, their translations in there as a bit of a change, or maybe come up with new Latin to fit the story. All sorts of ways you could use that. So there's that for, I think, all the picture stories. At the moment, the audio is, I would say it's about half done. Half the stories have got audio for them. So at the moment, you'll just see in the teachers area, there's a little file to click and you'll get the audio to play there. And then we will in time tag that through so that rather than just getting the audio file, students will get a screen like this, and the sentence that's being spoken will highlight. And again, that'll all be delivered online. So our view is really, there's the textbook and then everything else will stick on the website so that it's all in one place. We are a not-for-profit community organization, so a lot of our sort of feeling is that it's not just us writing this, it's everybody writing it. So if you create resources and you are happy to share them, then we're also building a community area to share resources. So that, that's up for you guys. There's some things in it now, but there's not a vast amount, but you can see how that will go. And we've tried to structure that so that it's fairly clear. If you're teaching Sabina, or you're teaching, you know, the language section here in chapter 1, this is where I go to look for materials on that. So I think that will be the easiest way of organizing everything, and that, because we're not making those resources, that will be open access, and anyone can, you know, access that. And if you're logged in and you've got a teaching account, then that will be sort of tied in with the resources that we make, so you don't have to go into sort of lots of different places. Okay, very briefly, if you haven't seen it, there's a vocab trainer that's all set up and running now for schools that have got you know, accounts, and that gives the student and the teacher quite a lot of precise data on how the students are getting on with their vocab learning, and that's a sort of an overview of it. Just want to quickly finish by just showing a little bit of the research. We looked earlier on, didn't we, at the future. One of the words we used within that was navigabis here, and we really wanted them to be able to sail, so that here was a, you know, first conjugation verb that we could put into the future rather than, you know, have to walk there. And they're in Arles, and they got to get to Lusitania, and it's about November. So the checking out that we did of can we use that verb was, first of all, to see, this is Stanford's thing of, okay, well, can you get there by boat, and how long does it take? And you can put it into the right season. So this is autumn, and we want to go cheaply because these guys are poor. Well, yeah, looks like they would sail. But, you know, this is what a Roman boat looks like. And this is a museum. If you ever get a chance to go to the museum in Arles, absolutely fantastic. And for those of us who teach French and Latin, perfect. Anyway, I don't think this, I mean, they've done a fantastic job on this, but I don't think you can always completely be certain about it. And so we talked to some guys who sail that region, who sail southern France, Spain, Portugal, and they said, you can sail as far as, you know, roughly Gibraltar, but in November you are not going to get a ship that looks like that up the west coast of Portugal and into the sort of the river delta you need to get into, with the sort of waves and the winds that come across. So we felt that was okay to use it. They could sail part of the way, even if they might then have to go on a cart. So things like that you have to look into. When we wanted to talk about a lot of money, the great thing now is that, you know, there's so much text. So Packard fantastically have a really good database of Latin literature that you can search. So we search for multam pecuniam, and again, I've taught, you know, multam pecuniam, much money, for 20, 30 years. Turns out it's never found in Latin literature. And so we thought, okay, well, just try switching it around. Pecuniam multam, never used. But magnam pecuniam, so this is how the Romans actually said a lot of money. So that sort of thing of checking things out, and then we look, well, magnum pecuniam or pecuniam magnum? No, can use pecuniam magnum, but much more likely to have this. So, you know, I'm not saying every single phrase in the book we have run through, but we have tried to double check things where we can, and sort of increase accuracy. Things like this with word order, nominative, dative, accusative verb, yes-ish. But actually, if we teach them that too much, runners very often broke away from that. So again, we use it to start with, but we try and move away from it fairly rapidly. This idea that adjectives typically follow nouns. Okay, so that is, again, that's what I was teaching for ages. This is research from 1918, I think, or 1919. That looks at actually the positioning of adjectives relative to the noun in Caesar and Cicero. And, you know, you can see here that actually, other than in stereotype phrases, things like res publica, you know, where you've got the noun and then the adjective, you know, very, very often the adjective actually precedes the noun more often than it follows it. So we've tried to bear that in mind with the writing. And yeah, that's just to show this was, I mean, it's really interesting, isn't it? So in the classical journey for Camwas, classical journal, sorry, for Camwas 1918. Really interesting how there's a lot of research out there, I think, that just hasn't been picked up. I've talked about the tres literae idea before, so we won't go any further on that. Okay, that's all, and that's sorry to have run over. Do we have questions? Sorry, it's probably gone on and on and on. Everyone just wants to go, but are there any questions? Hannah, are there? I don't know if you're still there, Hannah. Are there questions? If you've got a question, feel free to shout. Hannah, hi. Is there anything? No, everyone's completely bored. Sorry. Does anyone want to ask a question, or are we all okay on that?
Sorry, can I just ask a quick question?
Yeah.
So just look in your book, in the Latin to English dictionary at the end of the book.
Yeah.
So some of the words have a number by them, which I'm presuming is the chapter that they're in, but then a lot of them don't have it. So
no, you're right, Krenza, sorry. Where they've got the little tiny numbers, that is saying that it's in the vocab learning list for that chapter. So say that one of the students, you know, looks up saluto, for example, and sees it's got a 2, I haven't got my right glasses, so it's got a little tiny 2 next to it. The idea is that it sort of triggers them to think, oh, okay, actually, we're on chapter 6. I should know saluto by now, but if they look up, you know, SIFO, for example, hasn't got a number next to it, it's okay that I don't know that. So, and that really comes back. I was at a conference in the States, Wake Forest, I think it was 2003, ACL or something, and a teacher just said, oh, it'd be really good if, so, you know, so that's just a little bit of an update based on that. Does that make sense, Krenza? Cool. Susie, did you have a question or something to say?
Yeah, a little bit on the textbook. If they buy the paperback or the hardback textbook, do they also get access to the online, or do I buy the online? Or do
You've got it. Yeah, we did wonder about packaging it all up together, but in the end we didn't do it. Partly because it is just a nightmare to work out who has bought a book and who hasn't, you know, and then you end up with, please send in your receipt or all that sort of stuff. So there's two, so in the end we thought, we'll just like separate the two out, and if you buy the book, you buy the book, and if you just get the software, you can just get, so you can just have the book, just buy the software. If you want them together, there isn't a reduction, sorry, but it's, I think in the UK, it's roughly, you have to buy a school starter pack, which gets you 8 accesses. So, and that is $40 in the UK and 30 quid no, $40 in the US, 30 pounds in the UK. And then every additional user is $4 in the US and $2.50 in the UK. So, you know, I mean, and what I would say is have quite a few schools buy 2 starter packs, because they said, well, we've got 2 teachers. No, that's fine. You know, you buy 1 starter pack, that gets you 8 accesses. You could have 8 teachers all using it. So it is essentially, you know, as soon as you get more than about 10, 12 students, it works out at sort of in the States, $4 per student, roughly. Does that make sense? And that lasts a year, and that gives you access to everything, and it gives the students access to, you know, everything except the teacher stuff.
Right. So I would buy it, and then, or my school would buy it, and then I give those accounts to my students.
Yeah. What happens is you upload. We don't really want to see any student stuff at all. So you upload the class sets, and then the software creates usernames, and this is a bit of a nightmare. It creates a temporary password for them, because you aren't allowed to see their real passwords either, so that it's like mega secure. So it creates a temporary you give them their temporary password, they use that to log in, and it instantly says, right, that temporary password is gone, use this real password now. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So, and that system allows us not to have to store student email addresses, so that it's like mega safe. So there's that way of doing it. Or you could say to them, I don't want to get involved in buying any of this. Go and buy your own individual accesses, but then that's $20 each. So it is like massive because they get the book, you know. So, well, they don't get a physical book, but they get to see the whole book online. So it's significantly cheaper to buy them as a school, you know, and get a bunch of them all in one go.
All right.
Does that make sense? But for that
Yeah,
$4, they get
yeah.
access to the textbook and all the digital resources and all of that stuff.
Yeah, because I've been having kids have been emailing me about what they should buy on the website, and I just wanted to clarify that if they buy the textbook, they should not buy the online thing. I will get the online thing for them.
Yeah, I think so. And again, I mean, one way of doing it, you know, in the schools I've taught in have always been, we don't have any money at all. So I would be saying to them, bring your £2.50 into the front desk, and, you know, the school buy the accounts, but you got to pay the school back $2.50. But I know not every school can do that sort of thing. Does that make sense, Susie?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
We'll go through that in a bit more detail on Thursday in the tech session. I'll show that how that works and so on. Cool. Most of that money actually gets you, because we're going to be shifting quite a lot of data around now, tracking how they're doing and all of that sort of thing. It's really to cover our the cost that we pay to, we store it all with Google Firebase. So it, you know, we have to pay them for that. Cool. Do we have more questions? Other questions? No? Are we all good? Hannah, nothing in the
No, I don't think so.
Perfect. Okay. Well, look, last session for now is on Thursday, which is looking at the tech, and we'll be looking at that, you know, the logged in system as well there a bit. But as always, if you've got any questions, feel free to email, or, you know, you can, I think this, Hannah set something up on the website where you can say, can we have a 15-minute Zoom chat or something like that? So, but we're always here. So just ask. And if anybody says, you know what, it would be really nice to have a session on this thing, or I'd like to do a session on this thing, feel free to either put yourself forward and say, and thanks very much if you do, or to say, could we do a session on this? Because even if it's only, you know, 3 people want to come, it's really fine to do that. So, okay. Right. Cheers, everybody. See some of you next time, and enjoy the rest of the day. Bye.